Sorry guys, I hate to break this to you, but I've done a lot of thinking over the past few days, and I decided I need to take the channel in a completely different direction. I know that a few of you will be very disappointed in my decision to depart from my usual genre, but I think you'll be much happier in my decision to pursue something new. I've decided to become a paranormal investigator.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight.
Well, at least for today. I'm just kidding, but I did want to talk to you guys about a topic that has drawn a lot of paranormal investigators into it because of its very troubled history. I'll be the first to tell you that I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but I'll also tell you that I'm not going to go out of my way to visit a place that's rumored to be filled to the brim with ghosts. So, hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Blair, or the Illuminaughtii, and today I want to bring your attention to a small island in the northern part of Italy that is infamous for the countless terrible events that occurred there. Poveglia Island is a tiny landmass that floats between Venice and Lido in northern Italy, and has been known to the world since the early years of 421 AD. And for those of you that don't know, I actually used to live in Italy, and so when you live in Italy, you obviously want to travel around and see everything, so I visited Venice many times. While I was there was always an island when we would, drive by on the boats and in the taxis and stuff like that the tourists and the taxi drivers and everybody would always say, "You do not go to that island, it's haunted." And I vaguely remembered that, and I decided it was something I wanted to look into, so it was actually Poveglia Island, and that's what we're going to look into today. So let's find out, why is it considered to be one of the most haunted places in the world? Let's take a look. The earliest record we have of people living on Poveglia Island was in 421 AD, as I mentioned earlier, when people were forced to flee from Este and Padua in order to escape the invading Huns. And I really want to make a bad Hun bot joke here, but I'm just going to let you guys do it in the comments. So, in order to understand the horrific history of the island, I believe it's important to understand just what these people were actually running from. The Huns were a nomadic group of people who came from unknown origins, and prior to the 4th century, they traveled in small packs and didn't really band together all that often. For those of you who have heard of them, you might find this strange because they would go on to be one of the most dangerous and catastrophic empires the world has ever seen. This was catapulted forward when Attila the Hun was made leader as he began the incursions on some of the major European countries, including the enormous Western Roman Empire. The Huns were very interesting people. They were some of the first master horsemen in the world and revered their horses almost as gods. While they wore simple furs and clothes made of hide, their horses were decked out in gold-trimmed saddles and other pieces of armor decked in precious stones and metals. They used their horses to move quickly across the battlefield, disorientating their opponents and giving them a severe disadvantage. On History.com, they write that the Huns took a unique approach to warfare. They moved fast and swiftly on the battlefield and fought in seeming disarray, which confused their foes and kept them on the run. They were expert archers who used reflex bows made of seasoned birch, bone, and glue. Their arrows could strike a man 80 yards away and seldom miss their mark. Thanks to their experience lassoing horses and cattle, the Huns skillfully lassoed their enemies on the battlefield, brutally tearing them off horses and dragging them to a violent death. They also used battering rams to break through Roman defense walls. But the Huns' main weapon was fear. It's reported that Hun parents placed binders on their children's head, which gradually deformed their skulls and gave them a menacing appearance. The Huns killed men, women, and children alike and decimated almost everything and everyone in their path. They looted and plundered and seldom took prisoners. However, when they did, they enslaved them. So yeah, that's one hell of a terrifying history, and if I knew the Huns were coming to my town, I'd be getting out of town. So it's super understandable why people fled their land before the Huns, considering their reputation cast them in a terribly brutal light. And they did the right thing too, because shortly after they left, Padua and Este and several other lands were burned to the ground. And at that point, there wasn't anything wrong with Poveglia. It was just an island in Italy, and the people who moved there couldn't have known what would happen a few hundred years later down the line. When they arrived in the 400s, they knew they wouldn't be completely safe. They still had to fight off the Huns from entering, but because they lived on an island, it wasn't too hard to block off the main entrances and fight from the high ground. The people on the island survived and even began to thrive. They lived in relative loneliness until the 9th century without much interaction from Italy. However, in the 9th century, the Italian government took notice of the island and the people gained official representation in the form of a podesta. Then, when Venice came under attack in 1379, all of the people were moved off Poveglia so the island could serve as a vanguard defense position. After the battle against the Genoan fleet was concluded, the island remained abandoned. And the island remained like that for a couple centuries, despite the government's best efforts. One example was the attempt to have monks from central Italy move to the island in the early 1500s, when the Doge... Hold up. The Doge? Yes, I love a dead meme. Yeah, but anyway, so the Doge tried to get the Camaldolese monks to move onto the island, but they refused. The government didn't have to wait long to find a use for their island, however, because very soon after that, they decided to utilize the island to help with their ever-growing plague problem. Now, the bubonic plague is something I hope I don't really have to explain to you in great detail. It struck Europe with a devastating efficiency, and although the amount of deaths it caused is always held in contention, there are reasonable estimates that around 25 million people, or 1/3 of Europe's population, died. The plague lasted in separate places for nearly 300 years, and it kind of makes you worried about the state of the world right now, huh? Well, actually, fun fact, the word quarantine was invented because of Poveglia Island. People were forced to spend 40 days on the island in order to get into the country, and 40 is 40 in Italian. The Italian doctors wised up to the plague during the initial outbreak, and when it swept through the country again, they were ready. They sent everyone, even people they only slightly expected to have the disease, to this island, and most of them never left. Genevieve Carleton, a journalist for All That Is Interesting, writes the following. In the Venetian lagoon sits Poveglia Island, a small, unpopulated landmass cut down the middle by a canal. For all its unassuming appearance, however, it has a dark history and is said to be one of the most haunted places in Europe. A continent saturated with ghosts from its 3,000 years of recorded history. Many of these ghosts came courtesy of the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing off millions of people and cutting the entire population of some cities in half in a matter of months or even weeks. And the bubonic plague didn't stop after the famous outbreak of 1348. Instead, it reappeared again and again for centuries. In Venice, Europe's dominant trading port during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, officials took advantage of the Venetian lagoon's islands to isolate and manage its plague outbreaks. For centuries, Poveglia Island was Venice's solution to the plague, an isolated quarantine site where victims of the plague were sent after infection, with few ever leaving the island again. The small island, just 17 acres, housed over 160,000 plague victims through the centuries, and officials did more than just quarantine the sick and soon to die. They burned the corpses to stop the spread of the disease, and it is said that human ash from these cremations make up more than 50% of the island's soil even centuries later. It sounds like hell, just in northern Italy. There isn't any science to the 50% human remains, 50% dirt myth of the island, but it does lend a bit of credence to the sheer number of people who died there. 160,000 people is nothing to scoff at, and like I said, even if I'm not particularly a huge believer in the supernatural, what if I'm wrong? This would most certainly be the wrong island to be wrong on. And the people who died there weren't the only bodies there either. On the island, mass burns were common, almost weekly, where they'd pile up all the dead bodies in a ditch and light the whole thing on fire. They brought bodies into the island to do this because they didn't want to do it in their prized city of Venice. The jewel of their city, however, wasn't doing so well. The quarantine system was a step in the right direction, but they didn't have the medical knowledge that we do today in order to help them through the tough times. The Lazaretto, or temporary confinement for the ill, was temporary all the way until 1805, when it became permanent under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. That didn't last long, however, because the Lazaretto was closed in 1814. This wasn't the end of the plague by any means, but it was the time where the disease began to wind down. They still took precautions, but Poveglia had seen enough people die, and they closed it off to the public until the quarantine ended. Now, I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys what's currently going on in the world, but you can kind of see the similarities between Poveglia and the social isolation that all of us are going through right now. The Black Plague killed 25 million people during its run through the world, but I'm sure that with our medical advancements and better isolation practices, mostly, including not forcing people to stay over a month on an island wherever they need to go, well, maybe we'll get through this. Maybe. We might have to resort to island tactics at this point, I don't know. That's enough crap talk about disease, however, because this isn't really the real reason or the main reason why most people think the island is haunted. Just in case you thought this was bad enough, it's not. Sure, 160,000 deaths likely contributed to its ghastly history, but the truly angry spirits are likely coming from the mental asylum that was built on the island in 1922. In those days, mental illness wasn't very well understood, and anyone who differentiated themselves from the neurotypical way of life was deemed unstable and were at risk of being sent to the island. As I said, I'm a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but if there was a place where people would see ghosts, I think an island where 160,000 people burned is a very healthy candidate for that location. This, of course, is a very common point of view, and an article written by Sofia Rita Jada showcases the same opinion. According to a local legend, the patients of Poveglia's asylum reported that they saw strange shadows, probably belonging to the ghosts of plague victims, and that they could not sleep at night because of the wails of the suffering spirits. Obviously, doctors did not believe them. Patients were also subjected to tortures, sometimes even to death. It is believed that a sadist doctor did evil experiments on them, even performing lobotomies, as he believed that this cruel practice was a great way to treat and cure mental illness. The procedure was hideously wicked and painful, as the doctors used hammers, chisels, and drills without anesthesia or any concern for sanitation. Because of these horror practices, the doctor was tormented by ghosts who drove him crazy to the point where he jumped, or was thrown, from the clock tower that stands on the lagoon. By the way, the legend tells that he did not die from the fall, but that he was choked by a mysterious fog. In some silent and calm nights, you can still hear the bell tolling across the bay, despite being removed years ago. In 1969, the structure was permanently shut down and the island abandoned for the second time. Obviously, during the years, the island lured many curious and paranormal researchers. In 2009, for example, Ghost Adventure dedicated an episode to Poveglia, while in 2016, a group of American guys from Colorado were rescued at night by firefighters who, at their arrival, found them in a state of shock and panicking for having seen and heard paranormal entities. Just at night, indeed, you can hear voices, screams, laments, and strange noises, while researchers have recorded an odd electromagnetic field within the center perimeter of the island, despite there being no source of electricity. Nowadays, without the official authorization of the municipality, it is forbidden to step foot on the island, and offenders will be charged with criminal offenses. Yet, tourists use private boats or water taxis to visit this mysterious and spooky island off the Venetian coast for a couple hours. There are no official records of the whole story, but it has been passed down for generations through time. Nevertheless, the few who decided to tempt fate never wanted to go back because of the spooky atmosphere that reigns on Poveglia, also named the Island of No Return. So, yeah, it's a bit spun out of line for my taste. I wouldn't exactly call it the Island of No Return, considering many people have indeed visited and come back to tell the tale. But the tone of the article tells you just how certain people feel about this island. And by the way, that doctor that the writer speaks about, yeah, he did some freaky shit, guys. The torturing of the patients went through something like, I can't even describe it. Lobotomies, limb removal, chemical experimentation, it's rough. It kinda leads you to wonder whether or not the people on the island were actually seeing ghosts, or if they'd just been treated so horribly that they hallucinated and saw things they normally wouldn't have seen. That doesn't describe the several journalists, however, who have written detailed accounts of people seeing ghosts in the modern day on the island. It wasn't so much what Giovanni said, but how he said it. A stout, balding, no-nonsense sort of fellow, the local cold meats delivery man gave no hint of drama or exaggeration in a Venice bar, where word had spread two Australian journalists planned to spend the night on the famous Poveglia Island. Walking over to our table, the big man nods upward in our direction as he takes a seat, lights up a cigarette, and draws deeply through gritted, yellow-stained teeth. Watch out for Paolo, he is the bad one. He was the doctor there, he will cause you troubles, he starts, exhaling a billow of Lucky Strike smoke above our heads, as if picking up on a continuing conversation. I know them all, Paolo, Marco, Giorgio. Giorgio is okay friendly phantasma. My father would take me fishing there as a boy, and when I was older, I stayed there myself for 15 nights. When I came back, I told everyone what happened to me, the ghosts, what they did, Paolo's ghost mostly, pushing me, whoosh, whoosh, always pushing, and things moving. They all say, Nane, they call me by nickname, you are crazy. Now everyone says the same thing about the island. And you want to go there, so you tell me who is the crazy one. As quickly as he advanced on our table, Giovanni now retreats back to the bar, apparently content his duty is done. At a table next to ours, another man turns slightly. He is right, he says, over the shoulder before he turns back to slug his distinctive orange Aperol Spritz aperitif. It's not quite clear what Giovanni was right about. Dr. Paolo being a bad spirit, he himself being mad, or us, seems wrong to ask. One or all should probably have been obvious. Obviously, there's a bit of fear-mongering and mainstream media manipulation in there, especially near the end where they write, "probably should have been obvious," but the quote still speaks of people's true beliefs regarding the island. They believe the doctors could potentially still be around there, stuck as spirits because their souls were evil or something. I don't really know how ghosts work, as I mentioned in a previous video, but does being evil mean you get stuck here? I guess the whole meaning hell on earth is given a new spin. Anyway, in order to understand further why Poveglia has such a reputation, I would like to revisit the asylums in general and why they were so prolific in their time, followed by why so many of them have a reputation of being haunted. Now, there are, no shortages of horror stories about mental asylums in the early 20th century, late 19th century. We just didn't understand mental health at that time, and to a degree we're still learning now. But I'm sure most of you have heard the absolute horror stories of what happens and, things that are considered precursors to the modern psychiatric hospital, and it's, patterned with many mistakes. I'm sure as watchers of my channel, you've probably run across something where you've either watched a video or read something about the general mistreatment that went on in insane asylums during that time frame. But in the beginning, though, the hospitals weren't that bad, and none of them are really nearly as bad as the media makes them out to be. There's just an inherent alienation against mental ill people throughout the mainstream media, and that dates back all the way to these asylums. In the beginning, they were meant to be nice places, and the doctors and staff were supposed to treat the patients with respect. The University of Pennsylvania provides a very wonderful look at the history of asylums. The history of psychiatric hospitals were once tied tightly to that of all American hospitals. Those who supported the creation of the first early 18th century public and private hospitals recognized that one important mission would be the care and treatment of those with severe symptoms of mental illness. Like most physically sick men and women, such individuals remained with their families and received treatment in their homes. Their communities showed significant tolerance for what they saw as strange thoughts and behaviors, but some such individuals seemed too violent or disruptive to remain at home or in their communities. In East Coast cities, both public almhouses and private hospitals set aside separate wards for the mentally ill. Private hospitals, in fact, depended on the money paid by wealthier families to care for their mentally ill husbands, wives, sons, and daughters to support their main charitable mission of caring for the physically sick poor. But the opening decades of the 19th century brought the United States new European ideas about the care and treatment of the mentally ill. These ideas, soon to be called moral treatment, promised a cure for mental illnesses to those who sought treatment in a very new kind of institution, an asylum. The moral treatment of the insane was built on the assumption that those suffering from mental illness could find their way to recovery and an eventual cure if treated kindly and in ways that appealed to the parts of their minds that remained rational. It repudiated the use of harsh restraints and long periods of isolation that had been used to manage the most destructive behaviors of mentally ill individuals. It depended instead on specially constructed hospitals that provided quiet, secluded, and peaceful country settings. Opportunities for meaningful work and recreation, a system of privileges and rewards for rational behaviors, and gentler kinds of restraints used for shorter periods. Many of the more prestigious private hospitals tried to implement some parts of moral treatment on the wards that held mentally ill patients, but the Friends Asylum, established by Philadelphia's Quaker community in 1814, was the first institution specially built to implement the full program of moral treatment. The Friends Asylum remained unique in the way that it was run by a lay staff rather than a medical men and women. The private institutions that quickly followed, by contrast, chose physicians as administrators. But they all chose quiet and secluded sites for these new hospitals to which they would transfer their insane patients. Massachusetts General Hospital built the McLean Hospital outside of Boston in 1811. The New York Hospital built the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum in Morningdale Heights in Upper Manhattan in 1816. And the Philadelphia Hospital established the Institute of the Pennsylvania Hospital across the river from the city in 1841. Thomas Kirkbride, the influential medical superintendent of the Institute of Pennsylvania Hospital, developed what quickly became known as the Kirkbride Plan for how hospitals devoted to moral treatment should be built and organized. This plan, the prototype for many future private and public insane asylums, called for no more than 250 patients living in a building with a central core and long, rambling wings arranged to provide sunshine and fresh air as well as privacy and comfort. So, as you can see, it absolutely seemed like intentions were good and things initially were going well. The hospitals were actually fairly nice environments. The patients were treated relatively kindly, so long as biased people were kept out of the mix and everything seemed to be going well. Then, the root of all evil, the bane of the world, the problem that so many wonderful things face, came into the mix: money. You see, these asylums were mainly funded because only those who could afford private care they provided could be housed within them. Reformers throughout the United States, however, began to protest this and claimed that poorer patients should be housed there as well because they still deserved care even if they couldn't afford it. The government, however, took this idea and ran with it very, very far. You see, they did allow for this. They began to fund asylums with state tax dollars, and therefore the poorer but still mentally unsound patients were able to attend and be treated. During the 1870s, a boom of these facilities occurred, and practically every state had one or more facilities that were funded by state tax dollars. This only lasted a couple decades, however, because once the 1890s rolled around, the institutions ran into some serious problems. As mentioned, the wonderful governments of the world decided that they should use these new facilities to their advantage and redefined what was then termed senility as a psychiatric problem. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. This meant that instead of hosting the patients within public hospitals or other houses for old folk, these aging people could be sent to the asylums to live off of the public's dime. This meant that the number of people living within asylums grew to an exorbitant rate, reaching and exceeding capacity extremely quickly. Eventually, when the numbers got too out of hand, the states decided that they would pull funding from the asylums. They couldn't support such a massive influx of people, and for those with conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's, asylum treatment wasn't even an improvement over typical hospitalization. The federal government just wanted the burden off their shoulders. The staff of the asylums tried to make things work because they were dedicated to their patients, but this was where there was a large split between the asylums that cared about those patients and those that didn't care about those patients. Those that cared began training the nurses in more specific avenues, hiring more staff in order to keep places working fully and operating to help as many patients as they could. Other asylums, however, did not. Some of these places didn't hire trained professionals and instead were run by corrupt people who didn't believe that those with mental disabilities deserved to be treated so nicely. And this is where a vast majority of the horror stories come from. These doctors use these people to perform experiments, trying to further their name in the world by finding a cure through barbaric practices like chemical poisonings or lobotomies. These didn't work, of course, and eventually all asylums began collapsing. The University of Pennsylvania again spells out the demise of the asylums quite well. Training schools for nurses, however, could not stop the assault on psychiatric asylums. The economic crises of the 1930s drastically cut state appropriations, and World War II created acute shortages of personnel. Psychiatrists themselves began looking for other practice opportunities by more closely identifying with general, more redundant medicine. Some established separate programs, often called psychopathic hospitals, within general hospitals to treat patients suffering from acute mental illness. Others turned to the early 20th century new mental hygiene movement and created outpatient clinics and new forms of private practice focused on actively preventing the disorders that might result in a psychiatric hospitalization. And still, others experimented with new forms of therapies that posited brain pathology as a cause of mental illness in the same way that medical doctors posited pathology in other body organs and the cause of other physical symptoms. They tried insulin and electric shock therapies, psychosurgery, and different kinds of medications. By the 1950s, the death knell for psychiatric asylums had sounded. A new system of nursing homes would meet the needs of vulnerable elders. A new medication, chlorpromazine, offered hopes of curing the most persistent and severe psychiatric symptoms. And a new system of mental health care, the community mental health system, would return those suffering from mental illness to their families and communities. Today, only a small number of historic public and private psychiatric hospitals exist. Psychiatric care and treatment is now delivered through a web of services including crisis services, short-term and general hospital-based acute psychiatric care units, and outpatient services ranging from 24-hour assisted living environments to clinics and clinician services. offering a range of psychopharmacological and psychotherapeutic treatments. The quality and availability of these outpatient services vary widely, leading some historians and policy experts to wonder if asylums, in the true sense of the word, might still be needed for the most vulnerable individuals who need supportive living environments. So, asylums started out wonderfully and were doing a good deed in the world, helping people who weren't very well understood at the time. And again, I don't blame the reformers for wanting more people to receive aid, because it's hard to need help and not be able to afford it. The government, however, tends to do what it does and overlooks key components of why something's actually successful, and then tries to just mass reproduce it and then causes it to fail long term. So that kind of seems like that's what happened here. It just sucks when people try to make something better, and then corruption and greed, and then, of course, politics get involved, and then everyone is worse off than they were before. Hopefully that excursion into asylums of old left you a little bit more informed, but now I'd like to refocus our attention back to Poveglia Island. The asylum there, although not part of America, suffered from much the same fate, overfilled and understaffed. The doctor, again, was also rumored to do terrible experiments before he jumped, or was pushed, there's speculation about that, off the tower to his death. After that, the asylum essentially closed down, and there really isn't much information regarding the patients there. We do know that some were transported to other facilities around the country, and others likely died there due to lack of care. And it's a sad and terrible thing, and I'm glad that the medical world has progressed so far in today's society. I can just imagine the backlash that would occur if anything close to that could have happened today. Speaking of modern societies, we tend to have a morbid fascination with the macabre. This ties directly into our beautiful little island, making it a wonderful destination vacation spot for a different type of deranged specimen. Just Google "staying the night on Poveglia" and you'll find a myriad of results that paint a lovely picture of what the island is like. I'll focus on a specific one from backpackertravel.org. Getting to the island was surprisingly easy. I decided that paying 180 euros for the short boat ride was far too much and went out in search of a better deal. Shockingly, the first captain I talked to was willing to make the trek for only 130 euro. After reading countless stories online about the locals who refused to approach this place and the amount of time other people had invested in finding a brave soul to take them there, I was convinced I was going to be in for much more of a fight. When we got to the island, I watched him pull away. Things didn't really hit me the way I thought they would. Being 30 degrees outside, sunny, and watching the hundreds of boats zooming by, it wasn't exactly haunting. Even the mental institution, while admittedly spooky, lost some of its charm in the cloudless sky above. All of this changed when the motorboats quieted and darkness fell. Being without a flashlight, headlamp, or torch, I was at the mercy of the shadows and looming silence that gripped me. Laying 10 feet from the institution, I was frozen in place, afraid that even the slightest sound would wake the dead. My mind became a slave to the various creaks and moans of the building, working overtime and twisting my imagination like a drug-induced hallucination. It was all too much for me, but I had nowhere to run. I grabbed my pack and bolted to the dock about 50 feet away, praying for rescue, but I was imprisoned and escape was impossible. I slumped down on the dock and tried to calm myself, but there was no way in hell I was going to be in my original resting place. The thought of the 160,000 burning bodies and the evil doctor were too much to overcome. So I slid my sleeping bag on the dock and prayed for the sweet embrace of a dreamless sleep to bring me to safety in the morning. But sleep wouldn't come. No amount of ambiance could have helped me in the situation. I was at the mercy of my surroundings, and all I could do was take whatever the island decided to throw at me. For the next 7 hours, I stayed completely still with my eyes and ears wide open and my brain conjuring up horrible scenarios surrounding my untimely death at the hands of the living dead. But I never faced death in the face, never saw any demons, and never shook hands with the doctor. The sun rose just as it always has, and with return of my water taxi, I was brought promptly back to the world of the living, unscathed and unchanged. Would I go back to the island and do it all over again? Hell no. Do I still believe in ghosts? Yes. I may not have seen or heard any, but the overwhelming sense of evil that seeped into your bones inside that old broken-down hospital would be enough to convert even the hardest skeptic. Now, being me, again, I doubt that last bit. I don't think that an overwhelming sense of evil would be enough to convince me that ghosts roam the earth. But I can also definitively say that I won't be going near Poveglia Island anytime soon. I've been to Venice a couple times, obviously, kind of as I mentioned in the beginning, and I've been told multiple times by the tour guides and people that I speak with that you don't go there and it isn't a place that you mess with. I think that the island would creep anybody out. The knowledge of what happened there alone is enough to give me the heebie-jeebies, but that is terrible. And it's obviously awful that there were so many people who died there, and it's terrible that mentally ill people who needed serious help were tortured by the persons that was supposed to help them. But does that lead to ghosts? I don't know. There is obviously much less coverage over Poveglia Island than there should be. Looking on YouTube, there are only a few large videos on it, with several smaller ones that never got the attention they should have. It has a remarkably dark history for such a small island, and whether or not the Italian government is attempting to keep it quiet is, well, I don't know. It's unlikely considering the island went up for sale in 2014. And better than that, or weirder than that, it actually sold. Luigi Brugnaro is now the proud owner of Poveglia Island, and you know what? All the more power to him. I definitely would not want anything to do with that island, especially considering he's going to have to pour 16.5 million euros, or just over 17.5 million US dollars into it. And that's a lot more money than I have, and a lot more money than I'd be willing to spend on an island that might have the ghost of a crazy doctor coming around for me at every turn I look. On the other hand though, with the way people are nowadays, I have no doubt that if he decides to use the island as a tourist attraction, he will more than likely make his money back very soon. I know there are quite a few people, even within my personal circles of friends, who would pay a pretty penny to see the most haunted island in the world. I'm hopeful that he decides to do something more useful with the land, but let's be honest, the guy's a businessman, and he probably knows what he's doing better than me, and he probably bought it knowing he can make a boatload of money off of it. It seems that Poveglia Island is going to live with a bleak history forever, but maybe that's okay. Maybe a few places in this world are just meant to be remembered for the horrible things that happen there, because it makes the rest of the world with its vast expanses so much more thrilling to explore. But with that being said, guys, that's where I'm going to have to end today's video. I hope you all enjoyed this dive into a pretty terrifying place, and if any of you intend to visit it, just know that right now it's technically illegal, but the Italian fishermen have quite a few boats and a lot of them enjoy taking patrons out on a trip, as long as you're willing to pay the price. But in all seriousness, Poveglia Island is an interesting place with a bleak past, and I know this might have been a bit daunting to a couple of you, but just know that it's one tiny island in the middle of a beautiful world, and make of that what you will. So with that being said, that is it for today's video. If you liked it, hit that like button. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. If you want more content from me, including the other channels or my social media that I work with, links for everything are in the description box down below. So again, guys, thank you so much, love you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!